All right, Genesis 17. Genesis 17, verse 1. It says, and when Abraham was 90 years old and 9, that's 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be thou perfect. Okay, no stress there. God says be perfect. Now, this is not a new thing. He says that all the way through the Bible. That's what God expects. He expects us to be perfect. Now, he knows you're not going to be, but that's what he intends you to do. That's his goal for you, is perfection. It's in several places in the Bible. In 1 Kings 15:14. 1 Kings 15:14. It doesn't mean sinless, it means perfect. That is complete, whole, single-minded, single-hearted. 1 Kings 15:14. But the high places were not removed. Nevertheless, Asa's heart was perfect with the Lord all his days. So the indication here is there were so many other things he was doing that the high places he didn't get around to. However, his heart was perfect before the Lord all his days. So perfection doesn't mean nothing could have been improved on. It just means what you're doing 100% right between you and God with a full mind, a unity, something that you know between you and God is right, and you're not going to waver from it. In 1 Chronicles chapter 12, here we start to see a definition of it. 1 Chronicles 12:38. First Chronicles 12:38. All these men of war that could keep rank. That's saying something. Okay, so if you've got an army out there, you want them to be able to keep rank. They need to march together. They need to stay in step. They don't need to be running over each other, and they need to know where they're going. Could keep rank, came with a perfect heart to Hebron to make David king over Israel, and all the rest also of Israel were with one heart to make David king. So perfect there, he's explained it as being in step, in a unity, and we'll find it in Job. We saw that, I think, last week. Job was a perfect man. He declares him perfect twice in one chapter. In Matthew 5:48, Jesus says, be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. So Jesus himself, out of his own mouth, requires perfection. So that's something we can always work on. Genesis 17, verse 8. Genesis 17, verse 8. And I will give unto thee, and to thy seed after thee, the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Now this is talking specifically to Abraham and his seed that is not Ishmael, because he defines his seed is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 tribes. We covered that last time. He says it's an everlasting possession. That is Israel. God intends to have that land for eternity. Not just here and now, but for eternity. In Psalms 24, verse 7. Psalms 24, verse 7. He told Abraham that he was going to get that plot of land for an everlasting possession, and then he says, I'll be their God. So the purpose for them having the land is not just so they can have a plot that they can put on their wall that we got a deeded spot of land over here. No, it's so God can be their God in that land. Psalms 24:7, he says, lift up your heads, O you gates. The gates going into Israel, or into Jerusalem. And be ye lifted up, ye everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. Okay, that's where he becomes their God forever. That'll be millennium. That's when Jesus Christ comes through the eastern gate as Messiah, sits down on the throne of David, and then all of Israel are turned to God as the Messiah. In Isaiah 9, verse 6. Isaiah 9:6. He says, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders." So Jesus Christ is going to carry the government. He's going to be the ruler. "And his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end." And look at this spot right here. "Upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom," that's all Jewish, "to order it and to establish it with judgment and justice from henceforth even forever." And you don't have to worry about them trying to do it. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. It's nothing man has to put together. Now that's important to notice, because there are people who think that we are bringing in the kingdom, that it's a Christian's job to bring in the kingdom, to perfect everything, and then Jesus will show up. That's not what the Bible says. The Bible says man can't do it. The zeal of the Lord will perform it. In Isaiah 66, verse 22. Isaiah 66:22. "For as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord." That's in eternity, not the millennium. But he's saying even there's going to be a segregated, specific nation called Israel. And it's going to be that seed that he declared to Abraham is going to last forever, and they're going to get a spot of land forever, even after the millennium, in eternity. Genesis 18, verse 19. Genesis 18, verse 19. This is when the angels come to visit Abraham before they go down to destroy Sodom. And here's what God has to say to Abraham. Genesis 18:19. "For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him." Let's back up. Let's go to verse 17. "And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do?" Okay, so he's saying, look, I'm going to do something. I've already decided Sodom has to go. But should I really hide that from Abraham? I can tell him that stuff. And you do. You tell things to your friends. To your friends, you have a normal conversation. What's going on in your life, you share with them. God says, hey, look, something's about to happen, and I really want to tell somebody. Should I really hide that from Abraham? I think I can tell him. Let's see what it says. Verse 18. "Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him. And they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him." So God says, I can tell him, because I know that I'm not just telling it to a tabloid. It's not going to the media. We know how faithful they are to report a message. It's an Abraham special. He's a good friend. I can trust him. So I'm going to tell him what's going to happen. And God will do the same for you. Just like Jan was talking about, God prepared her for something that was about to come up. God does that. He will prepare you for the future. And you find it in the Bible. In the Bible is where you'll find it. He'll start giving you warnings about things, encouragements about things. But that's God talking to a friend. Now he says about him, one of the things that is important to God is he says he commands his children after him. So he's got his household in rule. That's important. It's a picture of something. The house we have here on earth is a picture of the relationship God has with his children. And so it's supposed to reflect. He said marriage is a picture of Jesus Christ and the church. That's the reason he gave marriage. So a marriage should reflect that same relationship on earth. The same thing with children. He said they should be in subjection to their parents. God is very specific about this. I'm going to cover this topic just because it's here and nobody talks about it. Leviticus 19, verse 3. Leviticus 19:3. Somebody's under conviction already. Leviticus 19:3. Ye shall fear. That's a strong word. Fear. Every man his mother and his father, and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Now you won't find that in some child rearing book that you pick up off the shelf at the bookstore. God says your children should fear you. This is God giving instruction to parents. Why? Because we should fear God. It's the direct picture. If you don't fear God, you think he's on the same level with you. Just like children who think they're on the same level as their parents create havoc. Proverbs 19, verse 18. Proverbs 19:18. It says, chasten thy son while there is hope, and let not thy soul spare for his crying. So he says there's a time when there is hope that you can correct him and he'll change. That also means there's a time that you can no longer chasten him. It will be somebody else's job. So this is God's idea of how to keep a household in the right mirror image of what he intends it to picture. In chapter 20, verse 30. Chapter 20, verse 30. The blueness of a wound cleanseth away evil. Spank them, and don't worry about leaving a mark. Now, you're going to... This generation that's coming up now is going to have to do this very smartly, because the government will come in and take your kids from you if you leave a mark.
On their behind.
On their behind. Yeah, there's a specific place for it. God made one spot on your body that's full of padding and is designed for a beating. He says, chasten him while there's hope, and he says, leave some blueness of a wound, that is a bruise. And he said that does something. It cleanses the inward parts. It gives him a clear conscience again. It cleans him up. So do stripes the inward parts of the belly. In Proverbs 22:15, he says, foolishness. Now that's a tough thing to... He didn't say that craftiness. He didn't say rebellion. He says foolishness. That's just being foolish. Is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him. There's a tool God's made that is for this specific purpose of driving foolishness away from a person. In chapter 30, verse 17. Chapter 30, verse 17. It says, the eye that mocketh at his father and despiseth to obey his mother, He's not saying you discipline for this. He's saying, I'll do it. The ravens of the valley shall pluck it out, and the young eagles shall eat it. God's in control of the ravens and the eagles. He says, this is something that you don't correct for. I do. That's tough. In Matthew 15, verse 4. Matthew 15:4. This is Jesus talking. He says, for God commanded, saying, honor thy father and mother, and he that curseth father or mother, put him to death. Let him die the death. That is pretty harsh. We don't raise kids that way. But there would be more tendency to fear your parents in the Old Testament, where there was a death sentence that could be pronounced against you, wasn't there? Now, I'm not advocating pronouncing a death sentence. What I'm saying is there should be some fear because of what it pictures. What it pictures is God holds your breath in his hand. He's in control of life and death. And you should fear him and you should honor him. And if you don't, he said, I can kill you. I can take you out. In Hebrews 12, verse 9. Hebrews 12:9. Hebrews 12:9 says, furthermore, we have had fathers of our flesh, which corrected us. He didn't say scolded us, disciplined us, any of that stuff. He just said corrected us. That's a light saying. That's a light word, corrected. And we gave them reverence. So that's what was achieved by it. Shall we not much rather be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and live? For they, that is your parents who corrected you, for they verily, look at this, for a few days chastened us. I don't know anybody gets punished for a few days. But he's saying here the Old Testament way was you were punished day after day. The punishment that God had instituted in the Old Testament was nothing like any punishment any child has ever received in our day and age. He says they chastened us for a few days, and keep reading, after their own pleasure. Now, Paul doesn't condemn that. He's justifying that. But he, talking about the Lord, for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening for the present seemed to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. All right, one other place. No, maybe several other places. Deuteronomy 25. This is not a popular subject, that's why we're covering it. Deuteronomy 25, 1-3. You've seen that in the Old Testament, children were punished for a prolonged period, not just one instant. He said, for a few days. Look at how many stripes you can give them as far as giving them a spanking. Deuteronomy 25, verse 1. If there be a controversy between men, and they come unto the judge, and the judges may judge them, then they shall justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. And it shall be, if the wicked man be worthy to be beaten, he shall be judged. He shall cause him to lie down, and to be beaten before his face, according to his fault, by a certain number. Here's the number. 40 stripes may he give him, and not exceed. So he says, when you go to give a spanking, here's the spanking, a beating, stripes, 40.
Between men.
Correct. That's stripes.
I know, but between men, it doesn't say children.
No, but it's the same thing you're doing with a child. You're beating them. You're giving them stripes.
You're going to beat them
Here's,
down 40 times.
that's what he says. That's why he said, don't let your soul spare for his crying, the blueness of the wound.
No, it's going to be dead in the
Well, he says not to exceed.
Not to
So
exceed.
it's up to your discretion.
Mm-hmm.
However, you don't exceed 40. And here's why. Because man has a messed up way of thinking. You're thinking it, and I'm thinking it too. 40 is too much for any child. Let's keep reading and see what he says. Lest if he should exceed and beat him above these many stripes, then thy brother should seem to thee vile, should seem vile unto thee. So he says, you're cruel if you go beyond 40. Well, I say you're cruel if you go above 5, you know. He's saying that punishment is to be severe. Why? It's a picture of something. You're supposed to make the child fear you because one day they'll not be there and they need to fear God. And when God decides to correct them, his 40 stripes are a lot more harsh than a man's 40 stripes. And he says, look, if you'll have done that, when I go to pull the paddle out, I won't have to give 40. I won't have to go above 40. I won't have to go to 40. Because they'll recognize, oh, I've been here before this hurts. I remember growing up getting these. That's the picture. Look at one other place. Titus chapter 2.
Especially if this went on daily for days.
Mm-hmm.
30 more times for 3 days. What's Titus between?
1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon. It's one of those little books before Hebrews.
Titus stuff?
Titus 2, verse 9. Titus 2:9. Exhort servants to be obedient unto their own masters. Now I know a child is going to buck at that and say, I'm not a servant. I'm not your servant. However, you are. You are there to serve and to obey. Just as we are to God, that's the picture. We are God's servant, period. So the same applies. You're building the picture. Exhort servants to be obedient unto their own masters, and to please them well in all things. This next phrase is very important. Not answering again. So when you're told to do something, you shut your mouth and you do it. The Bible says, not answering again. Furthermore, he didn't say, just do the bare minimum. He
What's
says,
the part that you agree with?
right. He says, please them well in all things. Your childhood growing up should not be a vacation. It shouldn't be, according to the Bible, because it pictures something. When you get out in life, you are in for a culture shock if you grew up as being able to get your own way in everything and not learning to please someone you didn't want to. If you can't learn to do things you don't want when you're a child, when you're an adult and on your own, you're in for culture shock. And God has set it up from the beginning. All right, Genesis 19, verse 2. Glad we're off that subject. Genesis 19:2. So these angels have come down, and they're going to visit Lot and tell him what's going to happen in the future here. But they don't just walk right up to the tent and say, hey, I got some things I need to tell you. And this is exactly what God still does. And he said, behold now, my lords, turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night, and wash your feet, and ye shall rise up early, and go on your ways. And they said, nay, but we will abide in the streets all night. This is not, I told you wrong, this is when the angels have gone to Sodom, and they're going to pull Lot out. They act like, hey, we'll just stay in the street, it's fine here, weather's good, it's a good night, we'll just slip out here. He said, no, don't do that. Come on in. God does this. God likes to act as though he's going to pass you by. And he wants you to compel him to stay. And if you're content letting him pass by, he'll keep on going. He intends you to compel him to stay. Luke chapter 24. Luke 24, verse 28. This is after the resurrection. Jesus has appeared to two on the road to Emmaus. And here's an event that takes place. Luke 24, verse 28. And they drew nigh unto the village where they went. And he made as though he would have gone further. But they constrained him, saying, Abide with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is far spent. And he went in to tarry with them. He wanted them to ask him to stay, but he wasn't just going to follow with them. He was not going to force himself on you. You have got to ask God for his presence. Ask him to stay. Ask him to reveal Scripture to him. You've got to ask. He's super polite. Furthermore, he's easily offended. Acts chapter 16. Acts 16:15. This is a natural thing. As soon as you get saved, you get certain character. When you're born, you get characteristics of your father and your mother. When you get saved, you get characteristics of God. Here's one of them that you should naturally just get. It says, and when she was baptized in her household, she besought us, saying, If you judge me to be faithful to the Lord, come in to my house and abide there. And she constrained us. She said, look, y'all are the ones who led me to the Lord. I just got baptized. I'm excited about it. Don't just run off now. Come on in, hang out a while. Maybe I'll learn something new. That's the same thing that Jesus Christ does. He acts as though I'm going to give you a little bit here and then I'm going to move on. And you've got to say, wait, that's good, I want more. Constrain them. Genesis chapter 19. This is the angels in Sodom about to tell Lot he's got to get out. They've constrained the angels to come on in and not sleep in the street. And it says, before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round about. Look at this. Both old and young, all the people from every quarter. These are some wicked men. The young men may not have been involved in as much wickedness as the old men, but they're still evil. It doesn't take, the act is what is evil. Sin is evil. Sin has been around since the earth began. Once you enter into it, it's just as wicked as the day it began. If you've done it once or you've done it 1,000,000 times, it's wicked. Genesis 13:13. Genesis 13:13. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. The men of Sodom we just read about, they're both young and old. God says they're wicked exceedingly. So sin, dabbled with no matter how many times, declares you in the new category, wicked exceedingly. Genesis 18:20. Genesis 18:20. And the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous. Not all sin is the same. there was a sin when Abraham told his wife to say that she was his sister. That's a sin. That's a lie. But he didn't go down and destroy a city for it. There's many, many sins in the Bible that did not create total destruction of 4 cities: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim. In Exodus 23, verse 2. Exodus 23:2. It says, "Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil." That's probably where the young men in this crowd fell in. They were just following the multitude. Let's keep reading. "Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment." Wrest meaning to twist. So he says here, there was a multitude of young and old that were involved in this wicked sodomy. And he said, we've seen that God said that was very grievous. A very grievous cry was coming up. And it was exceeding wicked. He says there, don't look at the multitude as having the answer. Rarely does the multitude have the answer. If you can't get comfortable being alone, you'll probably be in the wrong spot in a multitude. Genesis 20, verse 3. Genesis 20, verse 3. This is, Abraham has gone down and he's had his wife, who's actually his half-sister, but he says, whenever we come into a town, you tell them you're my sister. Because she was pretty, and he said, what they'll do is they'll steal you, because they'll want you for their wife, and they'll kill me. So just say you're my sister, and that way they won't think that I'm competition for them, and they won't kill me. That's just, I don't know how you do that, but whatever. Genesis 20, verse 3. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night, and said unto him, Behold, thou art but a dead man. For the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. But Abimelech had not come near her, and said, Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation? Abimelech is a Gentile. Verse 5. Said he not unto me, she is my sister? And she, even she herself, said, he's my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this. Okay, so this tells us something about the heathen. Many times there will be the question, what about the heathen who don't know? What about the heathen who don't have a Bible? Some small African nation that has never received a Bible. It's not fair to them. Obviously here, a heathen is getting a witness direct from God, and he knew who it was. God reveals himself and does not leave anybody an excuse. And here we saw Abimelech having a conversation with God, knows it's God, and knows God will wipe him out if he doesn't do what he says. In Romans chapter 2, verse 15. Romans 2:15. There are certain laws that God has that you can find in the Scripture. But you can also find them just in your own mind and conscience without a Bible. There's certain things you know are wrong. You know it's wrong to lie. Nobody has to tell you that. You just know it's wrong. When you give false information, you know that's wrong. When you commit adultery, you know that's wrong. When you steal something, you know that's... Guess what? Those are commandments, the 10 Commandments. But those are written in your heart. Let's read it. Romans 2:15. Which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts, the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another. God says the heathen have something built in. Even though I didn't give them 10 commandments and they don't have the Bible in their hand, they do have my laws written in their heart, and they know when they break them. Their conscience pricks them. Conscience says, hey, I don't like doing that. That was not the right thing. And so it does. It either excuses or accuses you. Genesis 20, verse 16. So we've seen the story of Abimelech. He lets Abraham have his wife back, and he's not too happy that he got in trouble because Abraham lied to him. Genesis 20:16. Now watch what he says. And unto Sarah he said, Behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Remember, it was her husband. Behold, he is to thee a covering of the eyes unto all that are with thee, and with all others. Thus she was reproved. There's a lot in that. We find the definition of reproof here. Reproved. So if you prove something, you're showing the truth of it. If you reprove it, you're restating a fact. And that's what he's done here. He's restated the fact. Your brother. Now he's saying the word brother sarcastically, because that's what she said he was. Although, he is a half-brother. Then he says, he's a covering of the eyes for you. That's what a husband is for a wife, is a covering. We'll find that in a minute. In 1 Corinthians 11. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 4. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 4. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoureth his head. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered, dishonoureth her head. For that is even all one as if she were shaven. For if the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. This is all sounds like a tongue twister, doesn't it? For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, forasmuch as he is in the image and glory of God. That's the picture he's taking. But the woman is the glory of the man. Okay, the woman is the beauty. There's no beauty in a man. The beauty is found in the woman. The man takes in the heavenly picture, the man is taking the spot as God. The woman is taking the spot as the church or the bride. Verse 8, for the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither is the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. For this cause ought women to have power on their head because of the angels. Have power on their head, that is, be covered. And we've covered that verse in detail before, so we won't keep going. But Genesis 21. Genesis 21:21. In our story, what happens is Abraham has a child, Ishmael. And Ishmael is not the one God intended him to have. He intended him to have a child, Isaac, from his wife, Sarah, not the maid. And that's what he did. And so Sarah decides, hey, this was not a good idea after all. She's making fun of my kid, and, this is going to cause problems. And Abraham says, well, hey, you just do whatever you want to. I'm staying out of this. So she tells Hagar to get lost. He says, leave, pack it up, and head out. And she comes back, verse 21 of chapter 21. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. So, Ishmael is not the seed that God had promised. Ishmael is a mistake, a sin that Abraham had committed. So he's not really Jewish, even though he's, half Jew. He's half in the line, but God declares who's a Jew and who's not. And he's decided Ishmael is not. His mother, of course, is an Egyptian. And so when she goes to get a wife for her son, she goes and gets one out of Egypt. Egypt's a picture of the world. Israel, which would be pictured by Isaac, and Ishmael, pictured by Egypt, always have war. You will always have war with the world, with your flesh. There's going to be times that you just feel like you're in a constant battle. The flesh says, do this. Your mind says, I want this. This makes sense. And your spirit says, no, that's stupid. That's what the Bible says. And it just feels like a real tug of war. That's what we have here. Ishmael and Isaac. They're brothers, but yet they're at opposite ends of the spectrum. Genesis 22, verse 1. This presents a problem. Genesis 22, 1. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here am I. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. God likes to test you with something you love. It does no good for him to test you with something that doesn't mean anything to you. You don't consider it a test. A test is something you love. He says, the one son that you have that was promised to you, that I blessed you with, what would it be like if I took him from you? He's tempting him, is what the verse says. Now that will present a problem in a minute. God tempted Abraham. That causes problems with a lot of people. In James chapter 1, James 1 verse 13. I don't know if I ought to answer this apparent contradiction or just let y'all answer it. James 1 verse 13. James 1:13 says, Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. Okay, so do you see a problem? James 1:3 says God doesn't tempt a man. God can't be tempted with evil, and he won't tempt you with it. In Genesis 22, verse 1, and it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham.
I'll give you some
Okay.
kind of explanation.
Go ahead.
Alright, so in the next two verses it says, But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin when it is finished bringeth forth death. So that ending with Abraham did not end in death.
Mhm.
It wasn't about sin. I'm going to view that as a trial, just like Job went through all those trials.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my explanation.
Okay.
Yeah, you have to look at the context. And God's got a couple of words in the Bible that have two meanings, and you have to look at the context. Like, he tells us to remember certain things, and it has to do with our remembering is a memory, brain issue. And God remembering is a timing, like God's timing. And God remembered Noah, and that's when he caused the waters to...
He's tempted because the flesh part of him can make a bad choice. The spirit part of him is not tempted because it knows what's right and it wants to follow right. The control center is you. Your mind decides which one you're going to follow. So you're tempted every single day, probably thousands of times a day. God didn't put a lot of evil in your path. In fact, He's restraining a lot of evil from our paths just to keep us from being tempted. But there's a certain amount that He allows in our life to test and train us with. In James, you're in James still. James 1, look at verse 3. You will find in this chapter that tried, trying, and tempt, and temptation, all of those words are used interchangeably. Knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. Trying. Look at verse 12. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive a crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. In Hebrews 11, verse 17, it says, by faith Abraham, when he was tried. So, tempted and tried mean the same thing, according to the Bible, and you don't need any Greek or Hebrew to figure that out. You just need to read enough Bible. In 1 Chronicles chapter 21, God is not the one responsible for the sin. The devil's the one responsible for the sin. God is responsible for allowing it to come into your path. 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1. And Satan stood up against Israel to provoke David to number Israel. Look at 2 Samuel 24, 1. Second Samuel 24, 1. And again the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them, saying, go number Israel and Judah. The king is not supposed to number the people. He gets a curse for that. So God provides opportunities for you to prove him right, not prove the devil right. You're being tried and tested. When you get a test at school, it's a test. But the test is not to show what you don't know. It's an opportunity for you to prove what you do know. So it depends on how you want to look at it. Now, a wicked person wants to find fault with God will say God tempting and testing a man is unfair to the man. Well, no, if you're doing what you're supposed to do and following God, it's a good thing. It's proof the power of God is real, and you can overcome normal temptation. In Genesis 22, verse 24. Genesis 22, 24. When we go through the Old Testament the way we're doing, we're going to hit some unpopular subjects. You'll just find things that are not talked about. Genesis 22, 24. It says, and his concubine, whose name was Reumah, she bare Tebah and Gaham and that guy, Tahash, and that guy. Okay. So the point is not all those names, because I sure don't know what they are. The point is, in the beginning of the verse, we find something, a concubine. What is a concubine? You'll need to know this because it's going to pop up throughout your Bible. And you want to know what a concubine is. At some point, you'll have the question, what's the difference in a concubine and a wife? So let's find out. A concubine in the Bible, of course, is a female almost wife. that is united with a man. But in the marriage relationship or in the household relationship, she's inferior to a wife. In the early days of the Jews, various causes of difference between a wife and a concubine was less marked than it would be amongst us. The concubine was a wife of a second rank, if you want to look at it that way. There's various laws recorded providing for their protection. A concubine got special protection. In Exodus 21:7, Exodus 21:7. And if a man shall sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out with as the men servants do. Okay, so there's special things that she's forbidden, to do hard manual labor. In Deuteronomy 21:10. Deuteronomy 21. You can write down in your notes verse 10 to 14, but I'm going to go to verse 14. And it shall be, if thou have no delight in her, then thou shalt let her go whither she will. But thou shalt not sell her at all for money. Thou shalt not make merchandise of her, because thou hast humbled her. So a concubine, while she was considered like property, and if you decided you no longer wanted this concubine, you let her go. She's free to go, but you can't sell her. It's not property that you can sell slaves and barter with. That's not allowed. There was they had no authority in the family. As a concubine, you really didn't have a leadership role. They didn't share in the governing of the household. They were there as a pleasure for the man. And this is wrong, but it's here in the Bible, so we're going to cover it. Genesis 21:14. Genesis 21:14. And Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a bottle of water and gave it unto Hagar, putting it in her on her shoulder and the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. So Hagar is a concubine. She's the one who had Ishmael, the son that God did not intend. So she did not have any ruling authority in that household. When Sarah decided she didn't like her, they could send her away. And that's exactly what happens. In Genesis 25, verse 6. Abraham does not learn his lesson. After Sarah dies, he ends up with more concubines. Genesis 25:6. But unto the sons of the concubines which Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac his son while he yet lived, eastward unto the east country. So he gave them gifts, but not an inheritance, because they're not really considered part of the family. They're more of a higher class than a slave, but pretty much a slave. In Genesis 16:3. Genesis 16:3. And Sarah, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abraham had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abraham to be his wife. So a concubine is a type of wife, but not a full-fledged wife. In Genesis 16:16. And Abraham was 86 old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abraham. So she's having his child, and she's considered a wife, but not just a full-fledged wife, a concubine wife. You'll need that when we get to the book of Judges, and we'll cover it deeper in the book of Judges.
Wouldn't they call it today like a kept woman?
I don't.
So when they keep them outside, they just keep them, they don't marry them.
Yeah, well, I don't.
It's more
I don't
like
know.
what they do in the Middle East, where they have wives and they still have that system.
Yeah.
It's really sad.
A lot of rich people have women.
Well, this is different than a hush hush thing.
Yeah, it's out in the open.
This is she lives in the house,
Oh, it's
and it's known, just like Jacob. Jacob had 2 wives and 2 concubines.
Poor fellow.
Yeah, it's a mess. Exodus 21 verse 7. Exodus 21:7. And if a man sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as the menservant do. But if she please not her master, who hath betrothed her to himself. Betrothal is a marriage. So this woman is not his wife, she's his concubine. But the Bible's calling it a betrothal. So it is a wife, but not a first-class wife. Then shall he let her be redeemed. To sell her unto a strange nation, he shall have no power, seeing he hath dealt deceitfully with her. If he hath betrothed her unto his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. So God began to regulate it, because he saw the wickedness of man was going to do this. Now, I'm sure this did not start, well, obviously this didn't start with God. It started with them picking up the customs of the heathen. The heathen around them were doing it. So they said, we will too.
Everybody's doing it.
That's right. Everybody else is doing it. In the New Testament, God restores the purity of marriage by declaring it. Matthew 19, verse 5. Matthew 19, 5 to 9. And he said, For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Just 2, not 3 of you. No concubine in the mix. Wherefore, they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. They say unto him, Why did Moses then command to give her a writing of divorcement and put her away? He saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your heart, suffered you to put away your wives, plural. But from the beginning it was not so. Okay, so this is the concubine stuff. He says, Moses allowed you to put away a concubine, put away your wives with a writing of divorcement. Just like we saw, they could let them leave, you couldn't sell them, all those rules. Verse 9, And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whosoever marrieth her that is put away, doth commit adultery. So in the New Testament, he's making it very clear. I'm not allowing you to do anything like the heathens did. I tried to control it with rules and regulations in the Old Testament, but your heart is still hard. So we're going back to what God set up. What God set up is one man, one woman equals one couple. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 2. It says, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, singular, and every woman her own husband, singular. No concubines in the mix. So, in the Old Testament, we saw them pick up many of the heathen customs, and God begins to regulate them. He begins to give more and more rules. Once you get to the New Testament, he said, look, me being lenient with you didn't work. So we're going back to the hard and fast rules. God said, and this is just a good thing to know, leniency rarely works for correction. Correction has to be hard and fast. And it's just normal. With compassion, you want to be lenient. But you can't be lenient because lenient does not result in repentance. Leniency results in let's push the line even farther. And that's what's been going on in the Old Testament. Jesus Christ shows up on the scene and he says, none of that. 2 of you can be married and that's it. 2 in a household, not 3, not 4, not any of that other stuff y'all were doing back there in the Old Testament. All right, Genesis 23, verse 15. Sarah ends up dying, and Abraham needs a place to bury her. So he finds this cave in Machpelah, and he says, hey, can I bury my wife here? And he says, don't just let me bury her. Abraham's a great man, and, you know, it'd be like somebody famous asking you if they could use your backyard for a party. Not quite the same analogy, but close. And the men there are saying, hey, look, you don't have to pay us for anything. You're a great man. Just go right ahead and do it. And Abraham says, no, I'm not going to just take something. I'll pay you for it. I want to buy it. Verse 15. My Lord, hearken unto me. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that betwixt me and thee? Bury therefore thy dead. I like this because it's sarcasm. He says, if you read that passage, the man says, hey, look, no, don't. I'm not going to sell this to you. You can have it. And Abraham says, no, you just tell me a fair price and I'll pay it. And this is the guy's answer. Well, it's worth 400 shekels, but what's that even mean? Don't even worry about it. So he told him what he wanted for it, 400 shekels. You find this all throughout the Bible. There's a lot of sarcasm. I'll show you another place. Philemon chapter 1. Philemon is a story about a slave who's run off from his master. And he meets up with Paul, and he gets saved and gets on fire and becomes a good Christian. And Paul's encouraging him to go back to his master and serve him. Philemon 1, verse 19. This is a letter Paul wrote for Philemon to take back with him so that his master would receive him. I, Paul, have written it with mine own hand. I will repay it. He says, if this man owes you anything, you just let me know what he owes you and I'll pay it. Albeit, I do not say to thee how thou owest unto me even thine own self beside. He said, look, anything this man owes you, you just let me know and I'll pay it. But I'm not even going to talk about all that stuff you owe me. So,
even your own self.
Yes.
Like I could be doing stupid.
Right. You need to come be my slave. Sarcasm's all through the Bible, and it's good. It lightens the mood. All right, we probably better stop there. We've gone about an hour and a half. We'll pick it up next week, Genesis 24:65.